Hi guys, welcome back. So today I'm wanting to tackle something that's usually people's pet peeve. It's usually a little bit of a bugbear really. So last time that I spoke to you guys, I put on a video about how to plan an essay. So how to really set yourself up for success when you're thinking about going about your research, but also really pinpointing your ideas before drafting. You're ready to draft. The blank page is looking at you and you're thinking, how do I write an introduction? Maybe you've written introductions for previous first, second year essays and they've just not quite hit the mark. It's a really tricky task. But the good news is, by improving your introduction and your conclusion writing, you can really give your essays a boost, okay? So I've marked quite a lot of essays now and I know that the top trick is to guide the reader through absolutely everything. If you're someone who's quite floral, if you're a literary person and you want to dive in and you want to dive in with a punchy quote because you think it sounds really good, hold back. You should know from your plan what the structure of your essay is going to take, and an introduction really needs three things. It needs to address the question and set out what the key issues are. It needs to assert your line of argument, and ideally it needs to tell the reader exactly where you're going to go, okay? So let's look at how these things would work in practice. Let me show you one of my introductions, really snappy for a 2,000 word undergraduate essay I did, and this helped me get a first class in the essay. So let's take a look on the screen together. Okay, so the question that I had was, is the Sappho epistle Ovidian? So this was an essay on Ovid's Heroides, a collection of poems that are written as letters from mythical heroines. You might be familiar with it, you might not be. It doesn't really matter. The point is to see how I approach the question, how I start to unpick it. So what I did first, well, I nailed the issue. What's the problem with the Sappho epistle? The inclusion of the Sappho epistle in the Ovidian corpus has been hotly debated because, so here we go, what's the big issue? Whilst the epistle has endured a separate transmission, its conception is attested in Amores 2.18 and it does bear Ovidian hallmarks. So what I've done, now that I've done my planning and I've read around the debate and the issues, I know that the two sides of the argument are, it looks Ovidian, it smells Ovidian, but it's not really come down to us the same way the other poems have. Nailing that point has taken a sentence. It's eased the reader into the issue, it's shown my awareness of the topic, and that again, you're showing an awareness of the source material. That is a T1 first class boundary marker. If in the introduction to your essays you're demonstrating some misunderstanding, then what you need to do is make time for that when you come back to an essay and start to really proofread. Don't just proofread for copy edit, so for apostrophes and punctuation and spelling. Proofread for content. And if you think you are phrasing things in a way that suggests you've misunderstood, I really recommend recording yourself and playing it back, okay? If you get the premise of the argument confused, you're going to limit yourself really to a 2-2 and below. So it's really crucial you don't do that. But again, you can nail it in a sentence. It doesn't have to be a massive long introduction. In a 2,000 word essay, you're really looking at 3 or 4 sentences. You want something quite punchy, okay? This is the debate. The second thing I did, I set out what I was going to consider, okay? This study aims to consider, really obvious. I'm telling the reader exactly where we're going to go. What am I going to do? So I'm going to consider the extent to which the epistle suits Ovid's Heroides and where we might trace Ovid's voice as he ventriloquizes Sappho in order to evaluate its authenticity. So what I've done here is I've picked up on the nuances. So I'm going to look at in what respects does the poem suit the overall collection, suit the overall work, and how really do we see Ovid coming through. By giving myself that task, what I've allowed myself to do is 2 things. I've allowed myself to refer out to the other poems in Heroides, so I can show a breadth of knowledge. Now it doesn't mean you go off on a tangent and talk about other things, but if you give yourself an opportunity to signpost in an essay and say, we see a similar thing later on in the work, we see a similar thing elsewhere in this author's work, you're showing a breadth of knowledge. when you're reading and you're doing wider reading for essays, it's not just about reading lots of secondary scholarship. For 2-1 and first class grade boundaries, it's about showing a really good command of primary sources. So if you can say, all right, we're focusing on this one poem, and if this one poem was written by Ovid, but I'm going to use his other poetry to do it, and I'm going to demonstrate my knowledge of his other poetry to do it. Tick, 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 tick. You've set yourself up to do well in the rest of the essay, okay? And then I'm going to look at the ways that he ventriloquizes Sappho in order to evaluate its authenticity. I've made it really clear that I'm going to be answering the question. So they know what the debate is, they know what my areas for inquiry are, what I'm going to look at, and they know that I'm going to be evaluating whether it is authentic or not. So I've not presented any foregone conclusions. They know that my argument's going to be based on, does it sound like Ovid? Does it suit the rest of the collection? That's what my argument's going to be based on. And I can let it grow and assert my final argument and nail my colours to the mast in the conclusion. So they're the key 3 things that I had to do in the introduction. It set me up for success for the rest of the essay. If you're struggling, if you feel like your essays are falling down, I really recommend checking these at the beginning and the end of when you're editing, really. And what you can do is actually quite a powerful tool is copy editing and proofreading your introduction and your conclusion side by side. So don't read the whole essay through, read the introduction and the conclusion side by side. Do they belong to the same essay? Do they reflect the same argument? Does the introduction tell the marker where you're going? Does the conclusion tell the reader not just where you've been, but what you've found out from where you've been? And this is a really crucial distinction that I think we should move on to now. Really often when I'm giving advice to undergraduates, they say, oh, I don't want to just repeat the introduction and the conclusion, so what do I do? How do I finish? And often, too often really, people introduce new material into the conclusion. Please don't do that. I think I've spoken about this elsewhere because it's a really common problem. Your conclusion, again, needs to do 3 things. It needs to be clearly signposted for a kick-off and tell us that your argument's coming to an end. It needs to say what your argument is in light of the evidence and tell us what you've found out. That's the thing that's missing from the introduction. Tell us what you've covered and where you've been, but tell us what you've found out. So if we look at the screen together, you can see overall, ding, 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 time for a conclusion. Could not be more obvious. Overall, the Sappho epistle is somewhat Ovidian in style and wit. It repeats the theme of heterosexual female abandonment. The masculinization of Sappho is at least consistent with contemporary Roman views on Tripades, and it blends different source materials in a typically neoteric Ovidian fashion. Now there's a lot of jargon here, perhaps if you're not familiar with Latin poetry yet, but in a sense that doesn't matter. What you can notice straight away is there's material in here that's not in the introduction, but that's been woven in, so I can clearly signpost to the reader where I've been and what I've done, what have I found out. So the idea of female abandonment being, something that's important to the overall collection is something that I found out throughout the essay. However, Sappho's incongruous masculinity makes the epistle's inclusion a matter of reader perception, whilst the exilic Ovidian devices provoke unanswerable questions as to whether Ovid would have revised this work alone or another author would have replaced it. And this is another really important point. If you've seen the video on the difference between A-level and undergraduate, this is perhaps a point to hammer home. Remember, the example I am using is a 3rd year essay, so don't freak out if this is looking a bit foreign to you. It's something you'll get there with. But the conclusion, it really importantly, doesn't say maybe yes and maybe no. At this level, evaluating is something you don't do throughout a whole essay. It's something you do with individual sources to then draw a conclusion from it and make an informed judgment and an informed choice, okay? If you're saying maybe it was Ovidian, maybe it wasn't an Ovidian poem, you're not really answering the question and you're not presenting a sufficient argument to get you a higher grade. So what I've done instead is say, in some respects, it is very Ovidian, and I've been specific, so it's not just about balance, which is quite non-committal, it's about nuance, it's about nailing in these respects, in these ways, it's Ovidian. But, so I've said that Ovidian devices provoke unanswerable questions as to whether Ovid would have revised this work alone, or another author could have replaced it. So it's saying if someone has inserted this poem, they've copied Ovid. And that's nuance. I'm not saying maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I'm saying if it was, someone's copying Ovid because there are sufficient hallmarks. And if you're unclear on that, maybe go back to the A-level to undergraduate video and help yourselves out. But again, introduction, 3 or 4 sentences, conclusion, 3 or 4 sentences. And just in sum, think about it as setting up a sat-nav for your marker. We mark so many things back to back. We mark like hundreds of essays, we have a 2-week turnaround. You need to hold our hand and say, this is where we're going to go, and this is my argument, and this is where I'm going to take you. And then at the end look at us and say, and this is where we've been, and this is what we've found out, and this is how I've answered the question. Do that and you can increase the quality of your essay many, many times over. It's the first impression we get and it's the last impression we're left with. Okay guys, I hope that was really helpful for you. Give it a try and let me know how you get on. And if you have any questions or suggestions, please put them down below. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share if you think that this would be helpful for history or English students too. Thank you.